All right, g'day everyone. Hi everyone, it's Andrew Whitehouse here. I'm very lucky enough to be the Research Strategy Director of the Autism CRC, and would you believe I'm also today's webinar host, which is a great honour for me. And this is the second in our Autism Month webinar series that we're hosting today. So over the course of Autism Month, we're hosting 4 webinars, which we're seeking to sort of improve the understanding around autism, as well as share some of the latest research and outcomes that we're having. And of course, we're all in a bit of a weird state at the moment where we're working from home, or at least have our freedoms a bit restricted. We do hope that you've been coping okay. We hope that you're keeping healthy and, most importantly, keeping sane. I myself have found that my parenting style has gone from 90% shouting, 10% fun to about 50-50. So I think there's a bit of a silver lining in that, which is terrific. And I hope you've also had similar insights in your own lives. In yesterday's session, we had autistic leaders discussing influencing change and effective collaboration within the autistic community. Tomorrow we also have 2 new sessions focusing on the connection and quality of life for autistic adults and building resilience in kids and teenagers on the spectrum. So today's webinar, you're here to listen to a fabulous webinar on early years and diagnosis. Now, but before we get started, you actually do have the ability to ask questions, and we'll have a little bit of time at the end to ask questions, and certainly afterwards you'll be able to send questions to the presenters as well. So you can submit text questions by typing the questions into the Q&A panel of the Zoom control panel. I'm reading this, you can see. It has 2 speech bubbles as an icon down the bottom. You should be able to see it. It says Q&A. So if you'd like to send a question in, we'll make sure that we try and get to as many as we can towards the end. So today's topic, in program 1 of the Autism CRC, it's called the early years, we're focusing on proving the validity, so the accuracy, the precision, timeliness and reliability associated with the diagnosis of autism, as well as targeted early intervention pathways. And of course, we know that diagnosis is a really important part of the pathway and a milestone in so many ways for autism clinical practice. It's really important that we understand how we can best help families get to that point, as well as what we can do beyond that point as well. So today we brought together leading specialists, who you'll see on your screen at the moment, to talk about a variety of things across Australia and New Zealand. So without further ado, we're going to get to our first presenter, and I am extremely happy to introduce you to Larah Meer, who is an autism CRC researcher and one of New Zealand's finest researchers as well. And we're really happy to have her here. So today, Larah is going to be speaking about diagnostic practices and experience in New Zealand. The project arises out of the project that was done within the Autism CRC of the National Guidelines for Autism Diagnosis, which are now clinical practice standards within Australian practice. And so New Zealand has been ahead of the curve in so many different areas in health and medical practice, and we look to them with envy in so many different ways. And I'm really excited to hear what Larah has to say today. So without any further delay, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to throw it over to Larah.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to get my screen share set up. Okay, I'm hoping everyone can see this. So kia ora, thank you. It's great to be a part of this webinar. So working on this diagnostic project has been one of my key roles since starting at Autism New Zealand about a year ago. So it's exciting to be at the stage of actually sharing our results. And the project, of course, wouldn't be possible without support from the Autism CRC and collaboration with Kaya Evans and her team at the University of Western Australia, as well as other researchers and clinicians in New Zealand. So Autism New Zealand saw this research as really important for people on the autism spectrum and for those who work with them, because we understand that diagnosis is a critical point that can have long-term impacts on an individual's life, as well as for their family and whānau. And over the years, we've also heard countless stories about the diagnostic journey, like the ones on the screen, and similar sorts of stories around differences in assessment processes between individuals and across the country, as well as that the post-diagnostic support can be fragmented. However, we also know that there are many great clinicians who are really passionate and doing their best to provide best practice diagnosis and care, and that at times they can be hampered by systemic barriers, lack of funding and resources. So this research really gave us a chance to see what was happening from a range of different perspectives. And in New Zealand, we do have an autism guideline, and we've had this in place since 2008, and it's updated annually on different topics. And the guideline was created to help clinicians make decisions during that identification, diagnosis, as well as ongoing support through the lifespan. However, we've often heard from the autism community that there's quite a difference between what is recommended in the guideline and what's actually received. So Autism New Zealand led this project to more formally investigate that existing diagnostic landscape, as well as the uptake of the guideline that we have in place. And we really wanted to provide quantitative and qualitative data about people's actual experience of the diagnostic process, as well as inform recommendations for improving best practice in the diagnosis and care. So we developed 3 surveys, one for children who were diagnosed with autism during childhood, one for adults who were diagnosed in adulthood, and one for clinicians who were involved in the actual diagnosis of autism. And we were really pleased with the responses that we received, so 640 in total across the 3 surveys. And across those surveys, all of the regions of New Zealand were represented. And nearly all of the responses on behalf of children were made by parents. So we broke up the diagnostic process into 3 key phases. First of all, looking at that identification and initial help sort, then looking at the actual diagnostic process itself, and then post-diagnostic support. And we've included some actual quotes from respondents in some of the slides, so when they pop up, I'll give you a moment to read those yourself and digest those. Looking first of all at that pre-diagnostic stage of identification and initial help, it was unfortunately characterised by a lack of clarity and delay in the process. So here's what one parent said, but was echoed by many. And for both children and adults, we found that the pathway to pursue a diagnosis was unclear, with less than a quarter saying it was clear, as is indicated in the figure by the dark blue and turquoise colours. However, that story around the actual process was quite different between diagnosis in childhood and adulthood. So looking at children, we found that on average, they're not identified until 4.5 years. And when parents did seek help, they were often guided down paths that delayed that diagnosis. So by being told things like there wasn't a problem, or to come back if there wasn't any improvement. And so as a result, we found that on average, children weren't diagnosed until 6.4 years of age, which demonstrates a 1.9 year gap between those initial queries and the actual diagnosis. And so this means that too many children are missing out on the opportunity for effective early intervention. And then looking at adults, we also saw a big gap between those first queries about possibly having autism and actually getting that diagnosis, so about a 4-year gap. But with adults, when they initially sought help 2/3 received a diagnosis at that first point of contact, indicating a faster process for obtaining an actual autism diagnosis in adulthood. And looking at the diagnostic process itself, clinicians indicated a good awareness of the New Zealand guideline, but there was some variability in implementations of recommendations that are made in the guideline. So as a result, we found different experiences in the diagnostic process between childhood and adulthood, as well as between public settings and private practice, as can be seen by these two respondents. So for children, we found it was a long time to receive a diagnosis, where the time from when they're initially placed on a wait list for that first appointment to actually receiving a diagnosis was 10.9 months on average, whereas for adults, this was a lot faster at about 4.8 months on average. And these time differences are likely because we saw that 72% of children were diagnosed in the public system, whereas adults were clearly underserved by the public system, with 71% being diagnosed in private practice. And so the slower speed is likely due to a range of factors, but probably demand being too high for the resources available in the public system, as well as the approach taken, where we found that children who were assessed in the public system had more clinicians involved in the diagnostic process, with a comprehensive multidisciplinary approach being undertaken 82% of the time, which is recommended in our guideline. Whereas adults diagnosed in private practice are more commonly assessed by a single clinician, so that happens about 2/3 of the time. And despite these differences in the processes, there were some common positive experiences when clinicians took a really thorough consultative approach. Overall, we found moderate satisfaction with the diagnostic process. And even though there was a cost for diagnosis in the private setting, the satisfaction was actually higher in the private setting for both children and adults compared to the public system. And this satisfaction was linked to less stress during the diagnostic process, to greater satisfaction with the initial help that the person received, with the manner of the clinician, with involvement of fewer clinicians in the diagnostic process, and shorter wait times to receive a diagnosis. And overall, really promisingly as well, as the satisfaction was higher than what we've seen in similar research in other countries. Unfortunately, post-diagnostic support was characterised by poor experience. For children and adults, only about a quarter were satisfied with the post-diagnostic support, and very few indicated that the post-diagnostic supports were well coordinated, as the parent in this quote reported. So common experiences suggested that there was a lack of support, in a sense that people had to deal with it themselves, often being given pamphlets but no real support, or when support was available, there are often delays in accessing it. So there was widespread dissatisfaction with services and resources, both for children and adults. And we found notable areas of dissatisfaction included counselling to adjust to that diagnosis, as well as vocational support, both for children and adults. And then there was also particular dissatisfaction with some government-funded services. So for children, this was early intervention and school support through the Ministry of Education. And in adulthood, this was disability support services through the Ministry of Health. within the New Zealand context, it's also really important to adequately meet the obligations outlined in Te Tiriti or Waitangi, which is our founding document between the government and Māori. And in terms of cultural support provided during that diagnostics process, we found that these obligations aren't being met adequately. So even though the cultural support for Māori and Pacific respondents wasn't actually needed about half of the time, where people did see that they needed that support, it was commonly not provided, as you can see in the purple bars of the figures on this slide. Promisingly though, there was more satisfaction with clinicians' sensitivity to cultural needs. Overall, results from this project show that some things are going well, but there's always room for improvement if we work together and are also supported by government. And so to do this, we see that the development of national and local collaborative stakeholder groups to lead New Zealand's long-term approach to autism are needed, and that these groups could ensure that changes are made in each of those three key phases of the diagnostic process. So earlier identification and clarity in the diagnostic pathway to ensure that the diagnosis happens sooner and more children have access to early intervention that we know plays such a critical role in development. Then to support consistency and timeliness of the diagnostic process through further development and uptake of our New Zealand guideline. And so that can be both on a clinical as well as a system level. For example, the guideline actually does recommend a pathway in the public system for diagnosis of adults, but clearly the results from this project show that this isn't happening. And so development of such a pathway could be achieved through co-design between key stakeholders who are involved in the process, such as autistic adults and clinicians who make the diagnosis, to ensure that it takes a really consultative and strength-based approach that we know positively influences experience. And finally, there's a lot of work that needs to be done around that pathway for post-diagnostic support. And this could be informed by a really comprehensive needs assessment that's done earlier in that diagnostic process, to ensure earlier access to ongoing support. So thank you everyone for your time, and I'll pass over now to our next speaker. And yeah, I think as Andrew said, we'll be taking questions at the end.
Thank you, Larah, and actually you're passing to me. I hope that's not too much of a disappointment, but thank you to Larah. Just to put that project in context, it's really difficult in autism traditionally and historically for consistent diagnostic practices to be experienced in a large area the size of New Zealand, the size of Australia, and that makes a cohesive and meaningful government policy extremely difficult. And so without consistent diagnostic practices where we're all talking the same language and every individual has the same start to their autism journey, regardless of who they are or where they are, we're lost. And so the importance of this project is really foundational in how we rebuild, improve, refine our clinical pathway for autism. So it's we've started that process through the National Guidelines for Autism Diagnosis through the Autism CRC in Australia, and New Zealand was ahead of the curve, and now that it's time to improve, refine, and make sure that their guideline is translated. So thanks, Larah, so much for that really important work. What we're going to do now is move on to our next speaker, and that's Kristelle Hudry, who's from the Trobe University, who's again one of Australia's top researchers in the area of early diagnosis and early intervention. And what Kristelle's going to talk to us today is about a really exciting study which looked at really trying to shake up what the clinical pathway is. currently in Australia, and New Zealand, we often diagnose and then apply intervention, but there's no reason why we necessarily can't apply intervention prior to the point of a diagnosis during infancy if we identify early differences in development. And Kristelle and her team did exactly that. So I'm going to shut up now and pass over to Kristelle.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I will now try to share my screen. And put it somewhere where I can see it. Okay, and hopefully that's going to work for everyone. So thanks very much for the invitation to present today. So like Andrew said, I'm going to be talking about a study that we've conducted with support from the Autism CRC, well, that we're still conducting, but the preliminary parts are ready to discuss, looking at preemptive therapy. I thought I would actually start though just with a quick overview of my place in the autism community, just for context. So I'm an autism researcher. I'm not autistic. I'm not a parent of children with autism. In fact, I'm not a parent at all. So just so that people have that context in mind when interpreting or thinking about how I interpret things. But I am an autism researcher and I've been working in this space for a long time. And my interests are really around these sorts of questions. So understanding how autism presents early in life, and so how it emerges, and also importantly, how outcomes are optimized for children and families both, including through early support, early intervention. I've been a member for a long time of the International Society for Autism Research. So attending annual conferences overseas, getting to really know other autism researchers who are working in this space and other spaces. I had the real opportunity about 10 years ago to spend 5 years in the UK working as part of two large projects, the BASIS team and the Preschool Autism Communication Trial team, which have relevance to what I'm going to talk about shortly. I've also held positions with the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre and the Victorian ASELC on campus at La Trobe University in the past, and I continue to be employed at La Trobe University, where we've conducted the ACES trial with CRC support, which I'm going to talk about today. So just for some background. So jumping straight into the ACES trial, like Andrew said, the question for us as researchers and as practitioners seeking to support young children with autism and their families was, why should we wait until a child has a diagnosis, has potentially gone through a long process to get a diagnosis, before we might do something about that to help support their outcomes? And if we get in preemptively, so in the early years before that child's diagnosis is determined, there's a potential, we think, to really make a substantial improvement on outcomes rather than waiting and for potentially months or years until the child's diagnosis is confirmed. But in order for us to have a good stab at this preemptive intervention or support, it requires two things. Firstly, an efficacious intervention, so something that has kind of proof of concept that it's going to be helpful, and also an accurate ability to identify children early who stand to benefit from support. And so really excitingly, I think for us, about 5 years ago, these two kind of planets aligned, if you like. So Jonathan Green, who's a colleague of ours in the UK, published a paper on an intervention which is called rather clunkily iBasis FIP. So I'll use the little BASIS logo to flag that one. So this is an intervention that showed promise for helping parents with young infants who might develop autism to support their infant's development. And then locally here in Australia, many of you I'm sure will be aware of Josie Barbaro's work on the social attention and communication surveillance tool, the SACS. And so this is a method for identifying infants early in life who might be developing autism before that point of diagnosis. And recently in 2018, Josie's presented some really strong data about that, the positive predictive value of that tool for really identifying kids from 12 months of life who are probably going to have a diagnosis a couple of years later. So with these two planets aligning, like I said, we launched the ACES trial, and what we've done for ACES is sought to test this hypothesis that among 9 to 14-month-olds, so if we recruit really young kids with early signs of autism, a relatively short amount of intervention, so 6 months of this iBasis FIP intervention, would hypothetically improve parent-child interaction quality, improve infant developmental and language skills, and reduce the extent of those early emerging behaviours that might head a child towards an autism diagnosis. So we launched the ACES trial. This is a full-scale efficacy trial with 2 sites. So our site that I lead in Perth, in Melbourne, and the site that Andrew leads in Perth, and also in collaboration with colleagues in the UK. It's a 2-arm trial, which effectively means that children are randomly allocated into one of 2 groups, a group who receive the intervention and a group who continue with services as usual in the community. And it's a single blind randomized controlled trial, which means that the assessors who conduct the outcome evaluations of the children don't know whether the children and families did or didn't get the treatment. Ideally, in randomized controlled trial worlds, we'd also have a double-blind trial, but because these are parent-mediated interventions, we can't not have parents know whether they're getting intervention or not. So we've gone with a single blind trial. Our trial design looks a bit more like this. So we had children at our 2 sites. I'll get my little laser pointer up if I can work it out. Here we go. So children in Melbourne and in Perth identified on the basis of the SACS checklist and referred to our team, at which point we did a baseline assessment and the children were randomised into one of these 2 arms, so to get the iBasis intervention or to continue with services as usual, following which we assess them again, and then we have some follow-ups, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. The timeline for this longitudinal research takes time. We have to wait for kids to grow up before we can sort of see how things have gone. So we started this trial back in 2016, and we're just at the kind of pointy end, shall we say, of the trial now, which is exciting. But what I'm going to present to you today is really about this middle part here, our baseline assessment for the cohort, the intervention, and then the outcome immediately following the receipt of that intervention. So the participants, this is, if you like, the plan for the trial, and this is how the trial actually unfolded. So we did screen 170 families for eligibility. Some were not eligible, but 104 families were engaged and randomised in the trial, roughly half receiving the intervention and roughly half of families receiving community services as usual. And what was great from our perspective is we managed to have all of those families, or almost all of them, stick it through with us and come back 6 months later for those outcome assessments, which is fantastic. The participants at the start of the trial, so not surprisingly perhaps, were mostly boys. There was a large subgroup of families who already had autism in the family, so had an older child who was already diagnosed, and then the participant child in the study was the younger sibling of that child. And children, like I said, were on average 12 months at the start of their time with us, but ranging between 9 and 14 months in each group. Families were mixed and diverse, mostly mothers participating but not exclusively, and mostly well-educated, but again, not exclusively. Very briefly on the therapy, but I'm certainly not the most qualified to actually talk about what's involved in the therapy delivery. So like I said, we're focusing here really on the part in between the baseline assessment, the therapy that was received by half of the families, and then I'll talk about the outcome assessments as well. But briefly, the iBasis Fit therapy is an in-home therapy series of 10 sessions fortnightly, where the parent and the infant and the ACES therapist work together. What actually happens during sessions is that the therapist starts by filming some parent-child interaction. This might be free play, it might be some snack or some other sort of slightly more structured activities. And then the parent and therapist together review the footage from the previous session, and the therapist can guide the parent to reflect on aspects of the infant's behaviour and the parent's own behaviour. And the idea here is to try to highlight emerging infant skills, so helping the parent to review the video and see things in their infant that they might not notice, you know, in real life with all the busyness of what's going on. So to highlight the infant's emerging social communication skills, and thereby to support the parent to gain insight into what they can do to continue to facilitate those. And then parents, of course, were given homework to do in between sessions. So in terms of the measurement, and again here we're talking about that baseline assessment, and then again straight after the end of treatment for the families who got the treatment, we're measuring 3 broad categories of things. So parent-child interaction quality using a measure called the Masi. This is a rating scale which captures things like how sensitively parents respond to their infant, and also infant positivity and liveliness in the interaction. We use 2 standardised assessments. So the Mullen Scales of Early Learning is a direct assessment delivered by an examiner with the child to test visual spatial skills, fine motor skills and language abilities. And the Vineland is a parent interview or survey, again tapping lots of different aspects of that child's development, including social skills and communication and language skills. And then finally, we did our standardized assessment of those emerging autism behaviours. So again, this is an administer assessment task with the infant to try and tap the infant's emerging social skills, things that we think might be telling us that an infant may be developing autism. So lots of different measures here, but our approach is really to try to cast a reasonably broad net to see whether we could get a sense of how this early preemptive intervention might be helpful for infants and their parents early on. And now I will take you through the results, which are complicated, but bear with me. So if you again remember our hypotheses, we were predicting that we would see a decrease in early autism behaviours and an increase in parent-child interaction quality and assessed infant skills for those infants who received the I-Basis FIP intervention compared to those infants in the community services as usual group. I'm going to show you the results, and there's a lot here, but I just want to explain it briefly and then I'll step you through the various parts. So this I've recently learned is called a forest plot, and this is a way of summarising lots of different results over a trial. So all of these down the side here are our various measures, and I will step you through these one at a time in a minute. What we see in the middle, the dotted line represents no change, so that a child or a group of children's scores at the end of something were the same as at the start. So dotted line is no change at all. Any sort of scores that are in this direction are favouring the group who received the intervention in our case. So suggesting that kids who got the intervention ended up doing better at the end than the kids who were in the community services or treatment as usual group. And then the reverse for things on this side here. So that's a forest plot. The dots tell you kind of for those who are interested, the kind of estimate of the effect. And then this line on either side tells you kind of how confident we can be. I think statistics and research are not an exact science. It's all about probabilities. And so hopefully that helps put some context around that. So these are the results. This is what we found for the children immediately after finishing the intervention when they were aged around 18 months. And firstly, what we're not seeing is our hypothesized reduction in early autism behaviours. So, you know, the little dot is on one side of our dotted line here, but the confidence is going on both sides of the line. So it's suggesting to us that there's no confident change in early autism behaviours as a result of this intervention or support. Same thing in terms of parent-child interaction quality. So all of these data points are kind of spanning that no change line, which suggests that the intervention from 12 months of age to 18 months of infant age isn't markedly impacting parent-child interaction quality. And in terms of developmental skills, things get a little more complex. So the Mullen scales here are our direct assessment of child skills. And again, we're seeing much the same, no significant or substantial improvement in the children in one group versus the other. However, when we look at the panel down below, we're seeing something a bit different about communication and language skills. So if you have a look here at receptive vocabulary, expressive vocabulary, you can see that these dots are definitely in the favours the intervention group. So what this is suggesting to us is the I-Basis FIP intervention with these infants who are recruited because they're showing early signs of autism is potentially having an impact in improving their early emerging social communication and language skills. So there are lots of next steps. This is the first part to our research, which is really exciting, but there's still a lot of work to do, which is perhaps also even more exciting. We're going to obviously follow the children up to ages 2 and 3. This was always part of our protocol and our plan, which was to see the infants early at 12 months, 18 months, trial the intervention in that time period here, and then keep following all the infants up to roughly 2 and 3 years of age. And the great news for our team is that we actually finished doing this in February of this year, and we're just processing all the data. There's a lot of videos for us to look over and score. There's a lot of data entry and checks to do, and then we're going to hand our data set over to the statistician, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and they can have a look at the numbers for us, and we'll have something to share later this year. The other things that we're wanting to do is really leverage the huge resource of really rich parent-child interaction footage from this cohort and do some extra observations of the children's emerging communication and language, because we're seeing that potentially interesting benefit of communication and language from this intervention. We want to go in and actually listen to the children's emerging language during these parent-child interaction tapes and see what more we can understand about that from these kids. We're also really excited that we've just got preliminary approval to aggregate our ACES trial data set with a similar data set that have been collected with a group in the US on another therapy called adaptive responsive teaching. And again, they've run a really great trial of ART with a community referred cohort. These are the only 2 trials like this that exist in the world. And we've got about 100 kids in our cohort, 100 kids in that one, there's a lot more that we can do and understand by pooling those together for a sample of 200 families with children showing early signs of autism who have gone through this longitudinal monitoring and intervention trial, which we think will be really beneficial for the field moving forward. And then finally, we've just started a new trial as well. This one's being run by Andrew and team, and we're recruiting expectant parents into a new study where we're seeking to see whether this idea of providing support early on in life rather than waiting until a child has a diagnosis could be really meaningful for families. So just to finish up, I want to acknowledge a huge team who are involved in this particular project, lots of financial support as well from different groups and in kind. And this is the full team, and then this is just a small subgroup of us who managed to get together last year. So by way of thanks to the team, and thanks everyone for your interest.
Thank you so much, Kristelle. What a good-looking bunch of people they are too. So
Thanks,
thank you so much for that. That was really terrific. And just to reinforce that we'll have those follow-up data out this year. And also, if anyone is interested in taking part in the study with regards to newborn babies who have a family history of autism, so if you're pregnant and have a family history of autism, please do get in touch with myself or Kristelle or through the CRC as well. Okay, we're running about 8 minutes behind time, but that's okay. I promise we'll have at least 2 questions, and I promise we'll also get to other questions outside of this as well. Please let me introduce you now to one of the rising stars in autism research in Australia, and that's Anne Masi for the University of New South Wales. Anne is going to talk to us about a super important issue which we all know, which is sleep. Impacts our quality of life, autism or no autism, and no doubt many of us have felt that over the last few weeks. Anne's going to talk to us about the biological and behavioural attributes that can lead to sleep challenges, particularly in the autism population. So thanks very much, Anne, and over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, I'll just share my screen here and hopefully this will work. Okay, is that working? Yep.
So we can see currently your screen, and we'll be able to see your notes underneath it as well. But it should be.
Is that right? Sorry, is that
there you go. Now you got it.
All righty.
Okay. I'm out of here.
Sorry, everybody. Okay, thank you for the opportunity to present this project today, which is actually just starting. It was recently a recipient of some funding from the Autism CRC's Utilisation Investment Round. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at UNSW, working also for the CRC, and I'm working on this project with Professor Valsa Epen and Dr. Hani Husler from the MADA Research. My role in the autism community, I started on the road towards research after the diagnosis of my 4th child when she was about 4 years old, and she's now 17. And she also experiences significant sleep disturbance, so which yes, obviously presents its challenges. So I'm really excited about this project and hoping that we can shed some light on some of the behavioural and biological reasons for disturbed sleep. But firstly, I'd like to lay a foundation as to why it's so important to continue to investigate sleep problems in autism by briefly looking at sleep in general. It's good to see that sleep is finally being recognised as a fundamental contributor to health and wellbeing outcomes. However, a good night's sleep is not easily achieved, as sleep is a highly complex state, making it vulnerable to disruption. Sleep arises from the interactions between multiple brain regions, multiple neurotransmitter pathways, and multiple hormones, which all contribute to finely tuned mechanisms. Therefore, the quality of our sleep is exposed to vulnerabilities from multiple potential stresses. This figure shows the impact of chronic sleep disruption and reduced sleep over time. When a person's experiencing sleep disruption, you can see the outcomes resulting from physiological stresses on the right-hand side of the figure. These stresses are activated via the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal pathway, also known as the HPA axis. This pathway is involved in a mechanism that drives levels of the hormones cortisol and adrenaline. Not good to have when you're trying to sleep. So that it's these chronically elevated cortisol and adrenaline together drive a widespread stress response, which initiates a number of processes, also detailed on the right-hand side of the figure. And these include release of glucose into the bloodstream, increase in heart rate and blood pressure, suppression of immune responses, slowing digestion, and also reductions in memory consolidation and cognitive function. Subsequent sleep loss and fatigue then drives the psychosocial stresses identified on the left-hand side of the figure. It's these psychosocial stresses are caused by an imbalance between the demands placed on an individual and an inability of the individual to manage these demands as a result of reduced sleep. So we end up with combined and interlocking effects of physiological and psychosocial stresses, leading to emotional, cognitive, and physiological pathologies detailed in this table. It's these sorts of pathologies and presentations associated with disturbed sleep that underlie the importance of maximising the likelihood of a good night's sleep. And that's what we're hoping to achieve for children on the autism spectrum through this research. So what does sleep disturbance in children on the spectrum look like? It can manifest as bedtime resistance, difficulties in initiating sleep, which is also known as sleep latency, waking after sleep onset, poor sleep maintenance through multiple nighttime arousals, and all of these lead to shortened sleep duration. And probably the worst of all after a night's sleep like that is early morning wakenings. So these type of sleep behaviours have been identified in 80% of children on the autism spectrum. And children on the spectrum are twice as likely to have sleep issues as typically developing children or those with other developmental conditions. So children on the spectrum are at high risk for sleep problems. Early sleep problems have been identified as predictor of later repetitive behaviours in childhood and also later inattention and hyperactivity. And there's been many studies identifying associations with daytime problem behaviours. And as previously discussed, if children aren't getting enough sleep over time, it may lead to long-term consequences on their health and overall physical well-being. So what to do? First and foremost, if a child goes to their sleep paediatrician or GP, they'll suggest behavioural strategies to improve sleep, which include establishing bedtime routines, avoiding stimulating foods and drink before bedtime, avoiding video games and TV, which emit the blue light. Now, the blue light disrupts your body's natural circadian rhythm. It reduces the amount of melatonin that's produced because your body thinks it's daylight at daytime when it's exposed to the blue light. Also, sleep environment will be addressed, including temperature of the room, the sounds and light. And there's been some success with parent-based sleep education and also children taking melatonin. The melatonin has been helpful in getting children to sleep, but the research is showing that it is not having significant impact on maintaining sleep. So where to start? Whilst behavioural and environmental factors contribute to sleep problems, there may also be genetic basis to people's sleep problems. And an example of a genetic basis is a gene-related alteration in melatonin pathways, which are essential for sleep maintenance. And these may contribute to alterations in circadian rhythms and consequently in sleep regulation. So in our study, we're hoping to identify and differentiate between a behavioural basis for sleep problems or if there might be a biological reason for disturbed sleep. So our research aims are listed here. we're firstly looking to define the difficulties that children on the autism spectrum are facing, including sleep latency, waking up to sleep onset and sleep duration. Then we're also planning to compare these alterations with non-autistic siblings and also control children. Then evaluate the relationship between these sleep difficulties and clinical phenotypes, including gender, autism profiles, cognitive level and sensory profiles, and comorbidities such as anxiety, epilepsy and gastrointestinal dysfunction, which is often associated with disturbed sleep. We'll measure melatonin and melatonin metabolites in urine samples, and then identify genetic influences that might be contributing to abnormal melatonin metabolism. And then we'll look to evaluate the interactions between sleep and melatonin profiles and phenotypic presentations. So we've received approval to access phenotype data and biological samples from the Australian Autism Biobank, and we've also received ethics approval from UNSW HRIC. We'll be analysing phenotype data from approximately 1,000 children aged between 2 and 17 and with a diagnosis of autism, and 200 non-autistic siblings and approximately 100 typically developing healthy controls. We'll then be performing the biological analyses on a subset of 300 children. So the measures that we'll be using, the Childhood Sleep Habits Questionnaire. I had the pleasure of doing data entry for the Biobank, and the Childhood Sleep Habits Questionnaire was part of a very comprehensive family medical and social history questionnaire, and it was by far the most completed part of the battery of all the questionnaires and measures. So clearly sleep is, first and foremost on parents' minds. So it's a validated parentally completed questionnaire that's been used to examine sleep behaviour in toddlers, preschool and school-aged children with a variety of conditions including autism. The subscales measure dimensions such as the bedtime resistance, sleep anxiety, sleep onset delay, sleep duration and night wakings. We've also got ADOS on most of the children, a cognitive assessment, either a Mullen or a WIS depending on their age, a sensory profile and adaptive behaviour using the Vineland-2, and also the family questionnaire, which is very extensive. So the analysis will report descriptive statistics on all our participant groups, and then we'll look at sleep profiles based on the key domains screened in the Childhood Sleep Habits Questionnaire, and they'll be compared between autistic children, non-autistic siblings and controls. Then within the children on the spectrum group, we'll look at those that have a sleep problem and those that don't have a sleep problem based on measures of sleep onset delay, sleep duration and total sleep. And then we'll look at the correlations between these variables and our behavioural attributes and our biological measures, including the genetic influences contributing to abnormal melatonin metabolism, and metabolite concentrations will be examined within the subgroups as well of the children on the autism spectrum. So we'll look forward to presenting these results via the Autism CRC, hopefully in about October this year. COVID's obviously impacted some of it, but we're due to get started on our phenotype data analysis and profiling in the next month or so. So we're very much looking forward to sharing those results with you. I'd like to acknowledge the children on the autism spectrum, their siblings and parents, and other children who generously contributed their time and their data and samples to the Australian Autism Biobank. There was a lot of requested of families, and we're most grateful for everything that they've done. and also the various sites who supported the recruitment to the biobank. Okay, there's some references, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anne. That was wonderful. And I'd probably also just like to say that this is a really lovely demonstration of how a project like the Autism Biobank, where there was a big Australian national effort to develop, to collect a whole lot of biological specimens from individuals on the autism spectrum and their families, how it can actually really translate to very applicable everyday goals that we have for our kids and families. And it's a really lovely demonstration of why that research process, which might have felt a bit torturous and a little bit arcane, actually has very real world applications. So thanks very much to that, Anne. We have 8 minutes, which, look, we can do a lot in 8 minutes. So we've got 8 minutes for questions. I'd love if people would be able to, come back on, which is fabulous. The first thing I'll just say is that to everyone, yes, the presentations will be available after this, after the webinar today. We can both the presentations as well as the actual webinar available. So you'll get information about how that's available after today. The other thing, there were a couple of questions from people with regards to particular Larah's presentation, as well as in relation to Australia. Larah's presentation will be, Larah's report about her project will be available on the Autism CRC website following its completion, and we anticipate that will be this year. Certainly, I hope I haven't put you on the spot there, Larah, and the Australian National Guideline, of course, is able to be available, downloaded on the Autism CRC website. And if you Google Autism Guideline and Diagnosis in Australia, you'll be able to find that there. So you'll be able to download that there. And that actually provides a lot of guidance about what should and should not be involved in an autism diagnostic assessment. I saw a few questions there. Okay, enough of me. I'm going to throw to Larah. So if Larah wouldn't mind unmuting herself, we have a question from, let me just see, sorry, I'll go scroll back up again because I did write it down. Larah, we have a question regarding the question of support following diagnosis. Did the respondents indicate what would have been helpful for them to have received?
Yeah, we looked at a whole range of supports, and so it was, because there were different supports that we looked at, and everyone's needs are different. So we found, different things were important for different people. But the one thing that I mentioned in the presentation as well that really stood out to us was that need for the counselling to adjust to the diagnosis immediately after that diagnosis, and that really immediate provision of some sort of support. So I'd say that was definitely one of the key things that stood out.
Yeah, and Larah, just while we have you, was the sample equally representative of males and females? There's a question around that.
Yeah, so for the child respondents, it was representative of the usual kind of distribution of 4 males diagnosed to every female diagnosed. And for the adult respondents, about 2/3 were females, which I think is probably also reasonably representative in terms of more females being diagnosed in adulthood.
Yeah. Terrific, great, thank you. Thanks, Larah. I might go to Kristelle now, if that's okay. And so Kristelle unmutes herself. So Kristelle, I was wondering, just talking about the more recent study. So you talked about the infant study, and there's also the new study that you mentioned about newborns or people who are pregnant and delivering a newborn who have family history of autism. Are you able to provide the viewers a little bit more information about that?
Yeah, so for that study, we're looking, I guess, at a logical downward extension of whether even providing support even earlier than when an infant is starting to show their own behavioural signs of autism, can that potentially make an even bigger difference. So for that study, we're using what is sometimes called a familial likelihood design, where we're recruiting parents who have, this is putting me on the spot, but this is good, parents who either have a child with autism already and are expecting a new child to come into the family, so there's a family history of autism going on there, or parents who perhaps themselves might have a diagnosis, so where mum or dad might have autism themselves. We're also aware that autism can be more likely in contexts where families or children have another condition, not just necessarily autism. So we're also really keen to hear from families where the existing child might have ADHD or an intellectual disability or so on. So I think if anyone's interested, we're really keen to have a chat to you, get in touch, and we can think through the complexities of also in where you're physically located. So, you know, we've got our teams in Melbourne and Perth, which sort of limits us because these are home therapy visits. We have to be able to travel to you. But please get in touch. We're really happy to chat about it. And hopefully
it's a really exciting study, and it's terrific to be sort of at the forefront of pushing things forward and providing family support from the get-go. I'll throw to Anne for a question now before we wrap up. And thank you so much for that. There's been a lot of questions regarding that figure you put up right at the start with regards to the impacts on sleep. I was wondering if you might give a sort of a 30 words or less explanation of that, and in particular how you expect the findings from your study might actually have translational impact.
Yeah, well, it is an interesting figure, and I think the most important thing that figure can do is draw attention to far-reaching consequences of disturbed sleep. And I being the parent of a child who has disturbed sleep, I think you can get a bit sort of caught up in the day-to-day survival mode. I'm in survival mode most of my life. And then without and the challenges of, say, implementing behavioural strategies are very time-consuming and exhausting in themselves. So I'm really hopeful with our work that we can start to differentiate between those sort of behavioural aspects of disturbed sleep and some of the biological aspects, so we can look more towards, well, you know, is supplementation with melatonin going to assist, or do we need to really nut it out with the behavioural strategies and stay with it? I think it's hard for families because they, you know, they're exhausted themselves. So, but I think if they've got more of a reason to stick with a particular strategy to help their child, you know, have improved sleep, then that's, you know, hopefully a good motivator.
Thank you so much, Anne, and that actually brings us to the end of the Q&A session, and certainly if you have further questions, we'll make sure that we forward them on to the presenters as well, and hopefully we can get you back an answer as well. Look, can I just say thank you so much to Larah, Anne and Kristelle for their time and their expertise today. It was really enjoyable, particularly, you know, to see people socially. And to see people socially has been quite nice as well. So just getting a message. Okay, and there's also in the chat box on the side, there's also a link to a feedback form with regards to the webinar you've had today. We'd love to hear your feedback about how we can improve this in the future. So this year's webinar series has been extremely popular with over 1,000 registrations, which is terrific across 4 sessions. If you'd like to share today's webinar, we'll also be putting it on YouTube, so please do share it there, as well as we'll be sharing it on Facebook and Twitter and all the usual places. If you'd like to know more about the Autism CRC's work across the lifespan, please do visit the website, which is a simple Google, Autism CRC, or you can sign up for our e-news and participate in some of our studies. You can also follow us, of course, on social media. Before I sign off, I just wanted to thank Callie and Tori, who are in the background and make all this happen. This just doesn't happen by itself, and it requires a lot of work, so we really do appreciate them doing this. And finally, and probably just as important, certainly just as importantly, thank you to you for your time. We know your time is very, very valuable, and it's been wonderful to share it. So for now, I'm Andrew Whitehouse, and we'll sign off. So have a great day, and we'll see you soon.